when the sky is high. No reason to stay on ground. Lift your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix book review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is a journalist and the author of 4 books, including Bomber Girls, the incredible true story of the female pilots of World War II, and A Spitfire Girl, one of the world's greatest female ATA pilots, tells her story about British Air Transport Auxiliary pilot Mary Ellis, which is the Aviatrix Book Club discussion book for November 2021. She's a regular correspondent for Britain at War magazine and has edited and produced museum publications. Her expertise, published works, and lectures on World War II subjects range beyond women's contributions to the British and Hollywood stars who served their countries in the aircraft wreckage unearthed from the sites of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. You can find her at her website, melodyforeman.co.uk. Melody Foreman, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much. And hi to all of your wonderful members.
Oh, thank you for saying that. We do have some wonderful members and several from the UK who sign on at the last discussion of the month, usually because it's early in the day, and it happens that it's hosted by the Los Angeles 99s, but the member who runs it has been living in the UK since we started the book club. So yeah, so we have several members from UK, South Africa, and the United States who join regularly. So, and they love your book. I can't wait to talk with them about it at the end of the month. So would you like to start us off, for the people who haven't had a chance to read it, with just an overview of the book?
Well, the book is about Mary Wilkins Ellis, and Mary was a first officer in the Air Transport Auxiliary during World War II. And it's only recently, really last 20 years, that the work of the ATA has become in the public eye. And Mary achieved a hell of a lot during her time with the ATA because she flew 400 Spitfires and 76 different types of aircraft. And when I say that sentence, it's a good time to stop and think, because that was a hell of a lot of aircraft that she was shifting over a matter of 4.5, even 5 years. So she had an awesome career during the Second World War, because it grew up out of a need, and there weren't enough male pilots who were able to, from the RAF, who were able to move aircraft from factory to airfield. So after it was set up in 1939 by Gérard d'Erlanger, there came a time when Pauline Gower, who became the head of the women's section of the ATA, she put forward the motion that she knew several women pilots who were equally qualified to join the ATA and help with this essential work that they were doing. So by the end of the war, there are actually 168 women who flew for the ATA, but part of that, part of the process and the social history was that Mary, alongside all of those other ladies who flew, helped create quite a lot of social change, which I'm happy to talk about as we go on. But Mary had a very long, successful life. She died in 2018 in July, aged 101, and I got to meet her when she was 96. So when we started the book, obviously I had to get quite a move on with a person who was very modest to the point she was sometimes quite shy about her achievements. And she often repeated the phrase, I didn't do anything. When I talked to her about the war, she'd say, I didn't really do anything. And then, of course, once I got to know her better and she agreed to the book being written, which took some energy from me to convince her that she was, you know, worth writing about, she showed me her logbook, and there it was before my very eyes, all these large amounts of aircraft, all these different types that we'd never see ever again because they produced so many different types during the war. And she was very much a person who, there was a kind of inner steel to Mary, that you knew that if she said something, she meant it. So we had some fun writing the books, and there were times that she didn't want me to put certain aspects in. So but I did after I'd convinced her it'd be a good idea. So I'll get onto those later. So basically the book is about this woman who achieved all sorts of amazing aviation bonuses in her career, and I felt that it was so important that, you know, we shared those with the world.
It's an incredible story.
Is that okay? Because
it's
hard to
perfect.
truncate it into the back of a beer mat, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is. I mean, because all of their achievements were so incredible, but hers, and it's really interesting to hear what kind of person she is. I feel like I got a sense of that through your writing. And I wanted to mention that just one of my favorite things that you do in this book, and that maybe is just part of her personality. Well, first of all, she's just very positive, and I don't know that everybody would present their experiences as positively as she did, but I did love the way early in the book, you know, she talks about how sexy it is to fly these sexy aircraft, and how, you know, how attractive that was and should be to the men that she was working with, because we hear so many stories about the trials of, you know, working in this male dominated field, particularly, you know, in the early days of it. So that was really refreshing to sort of hear that attitude from her. I have a question for you. Do you fly?
No, I don't. I don't actually. But the last time, Mary always tried to encourage me, because that was one of her first questions, Liz, because I know you're an amazing pilot. But one of Mary's first questions to me was, you know, do you fly? And I had to admit that I didn't. I was attracted to the poetry and the romance of the Spitfire, really, because I do have a family connection. Both my parents served in the Second World War, and my mother was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And I heard very much later on, just before I started writing the book, that my mother actually used to refuel Spitfires, etc., and help with barrage balloons and all these. I mean, she died when I was 2 years old, so I didn't get to talk to her myself about it. But there was this very odd feeling when I first saw a Spitfire. I had the sort of hairs on the back of my neck, and it was through working with Historic Aircraft Collection as a publicity manager that I got to meet Mary. So that's how that all started. And one of the questions she always said to me is, you know, oh, you must learn to fly, because she was quite impressed that I used to like riding horses. And apparently that was one of the early questions that Pauline Gower would ask the women who came to her to work for the ATA. She'd say, oh, do you ride horses? And then, of course, it was Mary who explained to me that if you look at a Hurricane aircraft, there's a stirrup, and it all dates back to the days of the cavalry. So you could put your foot in the stirrup and you could slide down this way into the Hurricane, whereas the Spitfire has the door. And so Mary's story starts with, you know, always wanting to fly as a toddler, and her father lifting her up and placing her on a cart horse to, you know, walk around the farmyard as a child, because she had this obsession of being up high. So when I used to talk to her about it, after meeting Mary, obviously I did get to fly, and I was very lucky to fly at Duxford in a vintage aircraft called a Dragon Rapide. You probably know what that looks like. It's a beautiful 1930s aircraft. I think it seats 5, and I remember getting in, and it was a real slope, but that was a wonderful experience. And I flew in that, and it was wonderful because I could actually touch the pilot on the shoulder, which was extraordinary. But it flew around Duxford, and of course there was a Spitfire which flew around, so we could all get some photographs, which was how everything started when I met Mary, because it was about 10 years ago that I was working for this organization that took passengers up in a helicopter who like to take photographs, and then of course the Spitfire and Hurricane would fly around the helicopter, and they could get the shots they wanted to. And Mary, I wanted to find out if we could get some veterans down onto the airfield, and it's a beautiful airfield. It's very 1940s, one big grass airfield, absolutely stunning. So she was really pleased to be invited to come along. I wanted to know if there's any women pilots left before I'd even heard of the ATA, and that's how we managed to get her down. And one of the funny stories was that they sent her an aircraft, I think it was a Chipmunk, to pick her up from the Isle of Wight, because obviously she lived over the Solent, so there was a kind of a flight involved for this, because she didn't want to drive. It's quite a hectic journey. You have to get a ferry and then drive from Portsmouth all the way down to Kent. So I could understand the flying. So she said, oh, I'll come over if I can fly. She said, I'd love to come for the event. So they sent the Chipmunk to go and fetch her. And the first thing she said when she clambered out of the aircraft was, oh, he was going so slow. He was flying so slow. Because she's used to the 400 miles an hour of the Spitfire. It was so funny. This poor guy looked a little bit kind of taken aback, but then she tapped him on the arm and said she was just joking.
That's adorable. Oh my gosh. There's so much there. So first of all, I loved the story about the hurricane in the stirrup, because I've observed, and we talked about this last year when we were reading about, or earlier this year, when we were reading about one of the early American women pilots, Pancho Barnes, in the Happy Bottom Riding Club, and just sort of this theme that I've experienced getting to know other women pilots, of women who ride horses or who have an interest in riding becoming pilots. And I love that you specifically addressed that in the book, and sort of the parallels between operating a machine like an aircraft and guiding a large beast like a horse.
Yeah. I mean, I did, there's a museum near to here, and they have a Spitfire simulator. So I have had a try at that. But sadly, when I did take it up, I did end up crashing into the fence at Biggin Hill, which wasn't too much fun. But they've got a wonderful guy there who was a friend of Mary's, called Jerry Abrahams. And he's 100 years old almost, and he's still at the museum instructing. He was a bomber command pilot during the war, and he's still instructing anyone who wants to have a go on the Spitfire simulator. So it's probably time to go back and see him and have another try. It wasn't that successful. I just felt really strange, and I kept thinking I was driving a car. It's so weird, the kind of rudder thing. So anyway, meantime, I'm not saying I wouldn't like to learn, but maybe soon. Yeah.
Well, first of all, don't feel badly about crashing the simulator, because it's a very different experience than flying the plane. I promise you that.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I guess it was a bit of a kind of a casino game. You do get that idea, but it was interesting, really.
Yeah. Well, and we'll forgive you for not being a pilot, because you brought your writing expertise and your passion and interest to Mary and the other women who flew during World War II. Tell me about that. So you were a journalist already, and how do you go from being a journalist to a book author and writing about these women?
Well, it's a long story, but I trained to be a newspaper reporter on a local newspaper called the Kent Messenger Group, and that was quite a steady training, and I did lots of qualifications in the late 80s under the National Council of Training and Journalists, and so I was kind of there in the romance of journalism. And I probably shouldn't say this, but it was one of those offices like the Washington Post where people smoked all the time, and I had a very lovely boss, and I won't mention his name, but he's not with us anymore, who used to drink sherry out of his mug instead of coffee, and there was smoke everywhere, and if you weren't in the pub, you weren't talking to people getting stories. And of course, now it's very different, of course. So I worked for 7 years for that particular company. And then I thought I'd quite like to be a famous playwright. And I went to university as a mature student. And I spent 18 months in Holland at the University of Amsterdam, and then Utrecht, which had a wonderful time. It was very liberating. I met lots of lovely Americans and people from all over the world in the seminar. So it was very kind of, enlightening for me, basically, to get out of Southeast England, where I'd been all my life. And then I returned, and I didn't become a famous playwright. I graduated. And then after that, I went back to newspapers, and then I worked briefly in television for some miscarriage of justice documentaries. And then it was back to newspapers again. And then in 2012, it was time to have a change, really. And print was beginning to really started to fold in on itself because of the internet, and advertising revenues were dropping down. So I went freelance, and that's when I was contacted. I remember I wrote a feature for a magazine about the experience that was being held at this farm near Hythe in Kent. I don't know if you know Kent at all, Liz, do you?
No, I don't. My grandmother retired. My grandmother retired. My grandmother was in the U.S. Foreign Service after she served during World War II as a member of the Coast Guard Auxiliary. But she married a British Royal Navy officer, and they retired to Surrey. So I visited, but I don't know it well.
Oh, excellent. Well done. Whereabouts did you go?
Well, I mean, so to Surrey itself, and that's
Oh, you went to Surrey. Yeah, that's
yes.
that's the next county on.
Yeah.
So we're sort of down right in the corner. But meanwhile, it was a kind of bit of a change for me, and I thought I tried the freelance route. I wrote a feature for a magazine, which then was seen by someone at Historic Aircraft Collection who saw the feature, and they liked what I'd written. And it was one of those ones where some features are quite difficult to write, but it was one of these ones where I just saw that Spitfire, and I just had this really weird feeling come over me, possibly because of familial links, I don't know, which I didn't know about at the time. So I just took the camera down there, and there was nothing I liked more than just, sitting there in the grass watching it flying over. And I met some wonderful, wonderful people. And that lasted for around four years. But I remember the last year that we flew, Mary came down 3 times, I think, 3 seasons of flying. But of course, it was all happening on grass, and there was very small crowds there, because obviously it was quite a kind of exclusive event, if you like. And then after the event, in the helicopter, people got a chance to look around the Spitfire and then talk to Mary and the pilot, and she loved all of that. She did like explaining what was everywhere. And then she said, I don't want to tell you too much, otherwise everyone will be flying one. So she used to be really sort of like tease people about what it was like and the speed. But I also remember she said to me, you can't relax. She said, if you're flying a Spitfire, and a Hurricane too, but especially a Spitfire, you can't just sail off and think you're having fun. And she said, because every single second you've got to keep your eye on all of the dials. So you have to keep them in a certain position, and you have to be going at a certain speed before you can actually decide you're going to come into land. So she was explaining to people, it was quite sort of tense. No flight was ever the same. And I hope I kind of sort of made that clear in the book, that she didn't ever claim it was a piece of cake to take off in one. And when Charlie Brown, the pilot, was about to take off, she always said, oh no, if he lets that engine run anymore, it's going to overheat. So she was always ready, as if she was still in the cockpit. So that's when it started. And so I then suggested they put some veterans in, as I explained, and then Mary came along, and we got chatting. And then also we invited Joy Lofthouse down to the event as well, and Mary knew Joy very well, and they often had some banter, and then they'd bicker. We liked a bit of bickering sometimes, even in their 90s, which was always fun. And then there was lovely Molly Rose, who I mentioned in the book, who was really helpful to me when I was writing the book, actually, because Molly was very avuncular and very outgoing. and she was much more forthcoming with information sometimes than Mary, who was just, oh, I was just having a wonderful war and I was flying. But Molly gave me all the sort of nitty gritty of what it was like when you took off and you found you drunk too much tea and you had to put down because you needed to spend a penny. So all those kind of stories came from Molly. And the complaints, there was nowhere to stay if you got stuck in Blackpool overnight, because the RAF, everything was built for the men, as I think we know I've discussed. So anyway, but when the aircraft experience that I knew was transferred to another air base, this was actually all tarmac. And so, of course, the owners of the Spitfire weren't very happy, because every time, it landed on the tarmac, the tyres were going to get bashed, and they're so expensive. So, and it kind of killed it on tarmac, the whole experience a little, because you didn't get the sense of the sort of wartime nostalgia with the tarmac and the fence. You couldn't actually take the camera out really to get the shots that you wanted. So then that sort of came to sort of a halt. And both of the aircraft, they were still based at Duxford, so they're flying around Duxford at Cambridgeshire now. So then by 2015 I'd floated this idea with Mary about the book, and floated it again and again, and we kept in touch. And then I made the visit to the Isle of Wight, and after that I can't remember how many visits I made, but whenever I could afford it, over I went again on the ferry, drove to Portsmouth, went over the Solent to see her on the island at Sandown. And we just worked hard to ascertain what information would be good for the book. And I think even halfway through, she still found it hard to believe that someone was actually writing down what she was saying, because she always told me that she felt guilty sometimes because she felt she'd had a good war, because she loved flying so much it overrode all sorts of things, apart from when of course her friend Dora Lang was killed. I think that did make her stop and think at the time. And Dora's story is in the book. However, Mary didn't want me to tell it. She said, I don't want you to write about death. I really don't want you to do it. And I said, well, Mary, there was a war on, and it was all sorts of people were dying. She said, well, I know. However, I don't want Dora's family to come after me and be upset. And so I had to explain that it was a tribute to Dora, and she was a part of her life, and I'm sure that her family would be pleased. And it was a long time ago. So she settled with it in the end, and she wanted everything to be very, as you said very earlier on, Liz, in our chat, very positive. She wanted to get that sort of positive message over, that to fly was wonderful, and she never forgot how lucky she felt to have been able to be part of the Air Transport Auxiliary. She thought that was a feather in her cap, but it was always something that she never, I never saw Mary misty-eyed. I never saw her ever show vast amounts of emotion. She was a very straightforward, she could be quite chilly sometimes, but I think that's probably because she got tired of people trying to fuss around her. And she lived on her own, I think for about 20 years after her husband died. And I remember one winter day I went there around this time of year to see her. I think it was in 2015, and she said she was trying to light her fire and there was coal everywhere. And I said, have you got some firelights? I'll help you. And she said, I don't want to be told how to light a fire because I'm in my 90s. So then she calmly did it, and there was a little bit of tension. So I then realized to, don't offer to help, because she had it all under control.
Very independent woman.
Oh, seriously independent. The last time I saw her, I think she was 100 then, and she was standing on a coffee table changing a light bulb.
Oh my goodness.
And she was, you know, I don't know whether you've seen pictures of her, but she was only about 5.5 stone. She was very a pocket pilot. She was extraordinary.
Those are beautiful stories about her, and it explains a little bit. You know, we had a couple of readers be like, you know, I'm not sure I would have come out of that experience with sort of that kind of very positive feeling, having lost people and being in wartime, but it helps understand who she was the way that you've explained her. What so obviously just the sheer number of different types of aircraft that they were getting in and out of with no training is incredible. But what else surprised you either about Mary or disappointed you, either about Mary's story or just the ATA in general in your research?
I think it was inspiring of Gérard Derlanger to create the ATA. I mean, he was very aware of that Hitler was amassing more and more aircraft in 1938, and he had this journey to and fro, because during the writing of the book, quite a lot of my background got, you know, sort of cut out by the editor, because obviously they felt it was a bit superfluous, but I like to do it properly so I can get it into my head. But I did write a little about Gérard Derlanger and his fight to get some sort of recognition for this idea. There were lots of male pilots left from the First World War who were still able to fly, etc. And then, of course, that filtered down to all of the creation of that, with the first few men, filtered down to Pauline Gower, who's another amazing character, obviously, who Mary called the Big White Chief. I don't know why.
Yeah, I was wondering that too. Like, why
and she always was, oh yes, the Big White Chief spoke to me once, and she said, oh, you're doing very well, Mary. So the women obviously held her in great reverence. I just a little aside from this, but I don't know whether you know my friend Alison Hill. She's writing a biography about Pauline Gower, but she's probably going to write to you about that anyway.
I do. I've talked to Alison.
Yeah, she's sweet, isn't she? She's great. So of course Mary's what I think when you say disappointed, I think I couldn't believe it when she told me that there were ferry pools run by some of the male ground crew of the ATA who refused to let the women land at these particular ferry pools, which is extraordinary when they're meant to be all in it together, you know. And this behaviour was just unthinkable. So can you imagine you have to change your route, and so will go, well, I'm not flying there and I'm not going to let them land, or I won't talk to them, or I won't help them. She told a story about some you know, some ground crew in the RAF where they wouldn't sit on the tail when it was windy, so to help her take off. And then of course, so she said, oh well, I'll do it myself then. And then of course she tipped over, and then there was a problem because the propeller was a little buckled. But they wouldn't help. And then there's the stories from Jackie Moggridge which are alarming, and they wouldn't believe that these little girls, the RAF wing commanders wouldn't believe these little girls were allowed to fly aircraft. So there was all delays with phone calls and have they got permission, and they weren't believed. And they were sometimes, you know, I think Jackie Moggridge said she would turn up to collect an aircraft from the factory and no one would let her take it off because they didn't believe she could fly it. It was extraordinary. So all of that's disappointing. And the idea that you know, when Mary landed and the night was drawing in and she'd have to stay overnight, you know, hundreds of miles from Hamburg, there was nowhere for her to stay because the men said, no, these are all our billets. Oh, you're lucky because there's some WAF billets over there. If someone's going on night duty, you can jump into their bed for a sleep. It's not very hygienic. Then, of course, there's no loos. There's no loos. So, you know, you had to either put down in the field to go, or you just didn't have a cup of tea in the morning. It was that sort of strange attitude. It was like the women were sort of superfluous, and I don't I think she made some friends amongst some of the male pilots, but of course, because she was in the all women section, I don't think she mingled that much with them. So they like to keep this separation going. And it sounds like there was quite a fight, but of course, thanks to Pauline Gower, it was the first time ever in the UK that women earned the same salary as the men who flying, which was an incredible achievement on her part for it.
No kidding. Absolutely. And you'll be appalled to know that as late as 1996, there was no female bathroom in the hangar at the air station that I was stationed at in the Coast Guard.
Wow.
So this is something
Wow.
that we've been dealing with that recently. It's ridiculous.
It is strange. It is strange, isn't there? And there's all this, myth around this idea that women shouldn't fly at certain times of the month. I mean, I think still that kind of goes on a little. And you saw my note about when Mary was running Sandown Airport, and she was still friends with Jackie Moggridge, who was then flying for a private airline, wasn't she? And she was ferrying passengers to and fro, I think Jersey and Sandown. And Jackie just could not reveal herself to be a woman flying that aircraft. So she'd contact Mary in the control tower and said, "Oh, put the kettle on, I'm coming in to land." She said, "I'll wait until they've all got off, disembarked, and then I'm going to run over to the control tower with my headscarf and a newspaper over my head." But they had a laugh, they laughed about it. But even then, if anyone had found out they'd been flown by a woman, they would have freaked out. It is extraordinary, isn't it? But it was laughed at then. They had to just accommodate it, and it was,
Well, good for them having a sense of humor about it. We don't all have that sense of humor. So
I can imagine. But the idea that, that Jackie was employed to, fly a passenger aircraft, and yet she had to kind of remain like out of the picture completely. It was extraordinary, because I think if she had revealed who she was, I think she was threatened with the sack, she told Mary. So
oh wow.
Yeah, it is that I guess that was the disappointing thing, where even in a time of great crisis, men still thought, whoa, women should be at home. I think it was C.J. Gray, the editor of the Aeroplane magazine, said they should still be at home cleaning hospitals or washing the floor and making the dinner.
Right. Yeah. And I saw that comment, that quote. Yeah. In fact, I marked that comment and quote in here because, I can't scrub a floor very well, but I can fly a helicopter really well.
Wow.
So, wow. It's just like, give me a break.
No, I know. And I know it was back and it was very different times then, but it was kind of, I think if you were a female and you were going to step out of the mold, you just had to take it on the chin, didn't you? And you met those confrontations, if they were confrontations, when you had to, and you had to kind of dance around them. Yeah. Which I think brings me to that old saying, wasn't it Ginger Rogers who said she had to do everything Fred does, but backwards and in high heels?
Oh yes.
Which made me think of of what the women were doing in the ATA. But of course they all believed in the honor of it, I think, and the duty. So I guess it pulled them through any annoying politics that was.
Clearly they loved the flying too, so that's what brought them there. So this book is so well done, telling us Mary's story, and then some of her cohorts as well. We got to know several of the characters that you already mentioned, but they were obviously part of this bigger picture of women flying during World War II. And you have another book, which I have not read yet, Bomber Girls. Can you tell us about that book?
Well, that started out that was an ebook, Liz. I was contacted by someone, I think it's changed name now, but it was called Endeavour Press. And they contacted me. I think they saw something I'd written for a museum newsletter or something, or one of the magazines, and they said, would you be interested in writing a book called Bomber Girls? So they'd come up with the title, and I said, yes, how many words did you want? And they said, oh, we only need 20,000 words because it's an ebook. So I did my best to kind of truncate as much as I could, but once you get going, 20,000 words is nothing, but that's all they wanted. So and that sold very well. When I think that came out in 2014. I know I'd already met Mary and we were about to start on the biography, or we were thinking about it. So that came out then and was only available as an ebook, and then I paid myself to have some put into print, basically, which I've been taking around to some of my talks, to some of the groups and things, to buy as well. So, but what it did for me was help me kind of get a real kind of a grounding into what was happening in regards to women in flight, and America, Europe, women from all over the world, and how they contributed to the war, and what the different situations were, and the different aircraft, and the whole subject kept growing. And I what I found was, whilst that book was only 20,000 words, there were so many stories, because once I start researching everything, it all starts coming at you, doesn't it, like some big mad octopus. And I had to make those decisions about what I conclude. So if there's just a couple of sentences, or there's not very much about the wasps, I do apologize. It was because I was trying to reel everything in, and then all the stories start coming out, and you start building up this big stack of biographies, thinking, it's such a massive subject. So that's how that started. So if you think Bobber Girls is a little bit ABC of women in aviation, it's I think they wanted me to kind of aim it for young people, for pupils, school children, and teenagers who didn't know anything about the war or women involved with flying.
Well, that's great to know, and it's a one book among a canon of books about women who flew during World War II. And then there are also so many other stories that haven't been told yet. Last March, I highlighted the women who flew for their countries during World War II. And so I highlighted a bunch of those authors in books, both fiction and historical, or both nonfiction and historical fiction, that feature characters from all of those, from all over the world. And then we also read, obviously, The Women Who Flew for Hitler by Claire Mully, which was also excellent.
That's an
earlier,
excellent.
yeah, it was very well done. You mentioned earlier sort of the context of social change that the ATA brought about. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, as I mentioned, this idea of Pauline Gower and her background. Her father was a politician, and Pauline worked for his constituency. He was an MP, so Robert Gower, and she got to be quite wise to the way politicians work and what she had to say to get what she wanted. So of course, when she became the section commander, she was all very keen to put forward this idea that women were doing an equal job, etc., and therefore they deserved equal money. But of course, by using her political nous, she was able to turn the tide on some of that male kind of refusal to accept and admit women into the wonderful world of fighter aircraft, because obviously at first the women were cast into this world of, you can only fly the Tiger Moth, and that's going to last forever during the war. And it was down to Pauline again to actually raise this idea that women had a brain and they could fly. Therefore, when could they fly the Hurricane? When could they fly the Hurricane? When could they fly the Spitfire? When? And so she kept on with this kind of idea of career justice, I guess you could call it, really. And finally, after talking to Lord Brabazon and obviously with her father's help, she lent on the Ministry of Defence, and eventually they got permission, didn't they, to fly. And so Winnie Crossley was the first woman to fly a Hurricane. And then you have Margie Fairweather, who flew the Spitfire for the first time. And I loved their reactions afterwards. I think Winnie Crossley just shrugged her shoulders and said, yeah, it was fine. And then Margie Fairweather just said, oh, it was delightful. Whereas the men, you know, they make a big fuss, oh, we're great achievers and we've done all this. And the women just went, well, yeah, it's, you know, it's a fighter aircraft. But it always made me chuckle because Freda Sharland, who's been dead a while now, bless her, but I've seen her in lots of documentaries. And she always said that the best treatment the women got really were from the Polish pilots, the male Polish pilots, because they always instructed the ATA women to collect a Spitfire Hurricane from the factory and make sure it was fully loaded with ammunition. So when they landed at the squadron, they could jump in immediately and go off and attack the Luftwaffe. Whereas usually they weren't, you know, they couldn't fly, they weren't allowed to fly anything that was loaded with ammunition, etc. But Freda Shalland's always said, oh, I was really tempted sometimes to put my finger near the red button to see what happened. So some of the sort of the social niceties had to kind of go by the wayside, I think, because Pauline did highlight these. And they got some allowances, although then of course you had these strange divides that I mean, I wasn't there, but I'd heard about from Mary and Molly Rose, especially between the women, because there was friction between Jackie Cochran and Pauline. The relationship wasn't very harmonious. That's probably another article, isn't it, or another book, but it wasn't harmonious from what I've read so far and the pilots I've spoken to. Because of the obviously the British and Commonwealth women and the lovely ladies from Argentina, etc. They were shivering in these really cold billets and things around Hamburg in the winter, and of course Jackie put some of her ladies up at the Ritz and various lovely places in Knightsbridge to live. So there was this kind of, must have been quite a lot of discordance there, which is, that's what happened. But,
it seems that Jackie was known for maybe breeding a little discordance in all of her efforts.
I got she was quite extravagant person.
Well, and extravagant, and her methods sometimes were interesting. I'll just put it that way. We're going to talk more about that, I'm sure, in March, when we're going to be highlighting the history of the women's space program, which she went on to be a part of, and a significant player in later on after the war, so in the 60s. So all of these ladies' accomplishments opened the doors for another British female pilot that we'll read about next year, Mandy Hickson, who wrote the book An Officer, Not a Gentleman. And so I'm excited to read about her. I know she flew a couple of combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So,
wow, that would be so good.
Yeah, she's a recent jet pilot. So we'll wrap up our discussion of the book and shift into talking about writing in just a moment. But before we do, you have a couple of other books out there that are also focused on World War II history. And I saw on your website, you offer some lectures. Can you tell us about those?
I do. Yes, well, there's a book I had published in January 2020 called The Wreck Hunter. And this is about a chap I wrote a story about. And then I soon discovered that this was very much like Mary, more than just an article, because he'd actually dug 900 wrecks from the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. So if you think of that, this started in 1962, before anyone really had started to dig aircraft. And the interesting thing about Terry, who's in his 80s now, was the fact that he, while all his friends in the early 1960s were out, seeing the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and doing all the 1960s things, he remembered the Battle of Britain as a child. He had a story that affected him very deeply. When he was 4 years old, he was walking along the high street in Biggin Hill, and Luftwaffe Dornier just strafed the high street and he had to jump out of the way. I don't know if you've read the book or seen it, Liz, but he always remembered, you know, this terror that shot down his high street, this bomber. And forever after, he was keen to remember the pilots, because he lived in Biggin Hill and his grandfather worked there, and his grandfather often come home with stories of, you know, who didn't come back and who did come back, etc., etc. So when he got his metal detector when he was in his early 20s, he started talking to various people in the village, and they'd say, well, a Spitfire went down in that field, and one over there and one over there. And so he gradually began tracking them down and then investigating as much as he could. It's the story really of how we chose out of those 900, I think there's 20, and how, because of what he'd done, he managed to make contact with relatives who had no idea of what happened to their father, their uncle, their brother.
Oh, wow.
And there's some very sort of emotive stories, and so that's was always a challenge to pick out which ones do we talk about, and what happened when he found the site was occupied. Now everything was done to find an aircraft that the pilot bailed out from, but there were occasions when, you know, he would be digging, especially before 1986, when the Military Protection and Military Remains Act came into power, and it became much more stricter. You couldn't just go out digging willy-nilly. You had to get permission, quite rightly, because there were people who were finding the remains of aircrew, which deeply unpleasant. So he always did his best to find the ones where they'd been bailed out. And there was a brilliant book published by Francis Mason called Battle Over Britain, which listed all the aircraft, including the Luftwaffe ones. And of course, remember, we live in the southeast of England, especially Kent and East Sussex, where a lot of them were going down. I mean, I think September the 15th was raining aircraft. So you can understand why there were so many just scattered around. And of course, the RAF were very busy, and if an aircraft went down into the ground, more often than not, it got left there, which sounds unbelievable. Or, which is worse, they sent the local scrap metal man to go and clear up the mess. It was brutal, and the British had a very odd attitude to how they recovered remains. And then, of course, 22 years later, Terry said that no one was interested in what he was doing in the 1960s because people wanted to forget the war. And, you know,
Right.
why are you spending all this time doing all this? But he did, and he got involved with various museums, and he actually dug an aircraft in my village in where I live in Kent. And I've actually got some pieces of some artifacts from that dig, which people find quite sort of, you know, emotive, very sort of visceral thing that they could feel, because that took part in, you know, one of the greatest well, it was the world's biggest aerial conflict that will ever happen in our lifetime. And you've got this little piece of an aerial, Bakelite aerial, that sends those shivers down my spine, actually, because I think, you know, objects like that, people want to hear about people who've saved their lives, you know, don't they? They still like to hear about heroines and heroes, or just heroes, and when you find something from an aircraft that's a symbol of liberty, as Mary would have said, so that book was quite a challenge to do, because there was quite a lot of piracy and things I had to sort of leave out, sadly, because I didn't really want to kind of denigrate the whole idea of it. But now, fortunately, it's regarded as a proper archaeology. It's recognized, and there's a group of wonderful ex-service men and women who belong to this organization called Operation Nightingale. And now, if there's any aircraft discovered, they immediately, you know, they're in charge of the scene. They cordon it all off, and a proper excavation is carried out. I think the latest one was about 8 years ago. They found, I think it was a Canadian an aircraft with a Canadian pilot remains still there, but every little thing they did was done with beautiful precision, and it was all, you know, wonderful. So it's very much more controlled now. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not just some sort of, you know, treasure hunters thing. So that was the Wreck Hunter, which I found, yeah, it was a interesting one to do. And I hope that, you know, those relatives that I managed to find, and there was one lady there who was Belgian, and her father, he left the family home in Belgium. The Germans had invaded, remember. His name was Albert van den Oostenrijk, and he tried to he left Belgium because the Germans were on their way. He tried to join the Free French, and that worked for a little while. And then, of course, France got invaded. So he made his way over to Britain to join the RAF, because, you know, and it's those men whose country had been invaded who were the most aggressive when it came to flying the RAF, as you know, as Claire pointed out to you with the Polish. Yeah. So I managed to basically visit the place where Albert got shot down on September the 15th, on the bloodiest day, which is about 10 miles from where I live. And the farmer has a plaque. The father of the son now put this lovely plaque up to this pilot who'd managed to bail out, but he got caught in a tree, which is really sad, was killed. But the aircraft went into the river. So Terry, in 1983, he, you know, got this Hurricane out of the River Stour, and basically, because he had a very unusual surname, I think he was Belgian aristocracy, and Albert, and we managed to track down his daughters, basically. And his younger daughter had found a letter that Albert had written to her mother, his wife, and it was very emotive, and it's in the book. But she said, for all of my life, I didn't like my father. I just felt that he'd run out and left the family. My mother never talked about him. And yet, when she read that letter that he said, I'm doing this for all of you because I believe in liberty, and, you know, I hate the way that the Germans have taken over Belgium. That's why I've gone to England. I didn't mean to leave you. And when she read that letter, and then she came down to the memorial, Adrienne, she was really, really, you know, touched, and she said, oh, I do forgive him, of course, now, but it's taken me 60 years to, because her mother never explained to her. She was just left with this idea from being a 2-year-old that he'd just disappeared, he'd just gone off, and he'd gone off flying because it was some sort of adventure. So it was that was an interesting one, and something I won't forget. So when you mentioned earlier on in your questions about how did writing the book about Mary change my life, well, it did change my life, and in a way that I still find it's history, isn't it? And I don't think we should ever forget those who took part in areas of history that had a real cause to them. And I don't think any politician should really be in politics unless they've studied history, because people keep repeating themselves. There's lots of repeating going on. So Mary's story was something that we could, you know, we could make concrete what did happen, and when will we ever learn? And the story of, you know, Albert van den Oostenrijk and all the other pilots the air crew that I were writing about, you know, including the Germans as well, and all the mysteries that went on around it. It just drives home to me all the time that history is the only thing we have to ground us in lots of ways, good ways and sort of bad ways sometimes. So sorry, I'm getting a bit heavy now, but that was the effect of the Wreck Hunter. And I'm doing a talk at Waterstone's bookshop, which is a very big bookshop in Canterbury in East Kent, about the Wreck Hunter. And
before you go on to the other things, I just want to stop there and say that so you personally experienced these things from your research and from
Yeah,
writing about them, and I kind of have a sense for why these things are important to you,
yeah,
having heard about your parents.
yeah,
And I, I posted about this on Veterans Day, and I was very deeply serious about the ways in which my opportunity to read these histories is truly starting to weave this beautiful fabric of connection between me, little old me, just another pilot. I'm not the first of anything, but the ways in which I am connected to Mary, and to the women who came before her. And the fact that you took the time to do the research, that you spent the time with Mary to tell her story, it helps me understand history. It helps me understand my place in it. I'm not, I was never a history buff. I had to study some of it for some of my military development. There are certain histories that interest me more than others. And so I've spent a little more time on those, particularly Caribbean history, in the context of my work. But for me, as a woman, and as a pilot, I have this access point through books like yours to the broader picture of history also, that I wouldn't necessarily maybe have been interested in without having that connection. So all of that to say, my deepest gratitude for your
oh,
work.
thank you.
And
I was concerned about the technology of the aircraft, because I knew that aviation is quite still male dominated, and they're very into the technology of aircraft, aren't they? Whenever I've been whenever I've done any talks or lectures to anyone about women pilots of World War II, or talked about Mary and things, there's always the odd hand that goes up who starts questioning me about the different marks of Spitfire. And there was
exhausting, I'm sorry.
no, it is not your fault. It's always the guys who get very, because I mean I like the social history, let's be honest, but the technology of it is quite scary for someone like me who's a humanities person. And I know about the 26 different marks of Spitfire, so I know the basics, and the teardrop cockpit hood, and the one that didn't open properly, and I kind of learned all the things that kind of people remark upon, but the actual technology of how it all flies and everything, I'm not really great on. So there was I remember one guy who asked me, he said, I won't do the accent. He said, I spoke to Mary Ellis, he said, and she said her favorite was the Mark 9. Mary had told me she liked the Mark 5. So I know, and I said to him, and he was getting quite aggressive about this. He said, but you've got that wrong. I said, well, she told me one thing, she told you another. She might have been talking about the height, because I think the Mark 9 could go higher at a better speed than the Mark 5, but the Mark 5 was more nifty, she said. So but he was very annoyed about this. But fortunately, the person hosting the event moved the question on. Some of the other comedy ones I've had, Liz, was a gentleman of a certain age was quite annoyed to find out that they didn't have any awareness of health and safety. And I was on the verge of saying there was a war on. He said, but weren't they aware? Didn't they have to fill in any forms about, didn't they have any safety? I said they had a parachute. In those days they had a parachute. He said, but why did they fly if they knew the risks? And it's turned into some sort of, weird, and he said, well, what do you know? What do you know? Because, Mary was a little girl. And then he started all this thing again with, actually, why should women be flying? But then he was someone else, and I got moved on from, fortunately. Otherwise there would have been some interesting further developments, and a word might have been used like
well,
like
I thank you for enduring that absurdity.
It's England, isn't it? And you're going to get this. So I try to kind of have a bit of a joke with it, really, and try and sort of bat them away when they say that. But majoritively, people really like to hear especially because so much of it took part around this part of Britain. You know, Mary was often flying over Kent. I think she told me, you know, about the various airfields that she knew, and Lashington and things. And so, and we still have Spitfire up the road at Headcorn, which flies over quite a bit. So she'd be thrilled that I think that lovely people like yourself still want to hear what she did and what all her friends did. That's that. And then the other book I've sent to my publisher in March is the Battlefield to Big Screen, which got me back into some more aviation again, because I've written about 3 Hollywood British stars. I focused it on the 3 of them, but of course there were so many that I couldn't get into this book. So we're looking at Sir Laurence Olivier in the Fleet Air Arm, bit of a hopeless pilot really, actually, when I look at it. But what does he share? What does he share in common with Mary? You'll never guess. Okay, Mary's least favorite aircraft was the Walrus. She said it was like flying an elephant, and of course she saw her friend Anne Walker very badly injured when it went into the hedge instead of taking off. So Mary hated the Walrus. She would talk endlessly about the Walrus, and of course it's so bizarre because it was designed by R.J. Mitchell, who designed the wonderful Spitfire. So the Walrus was hated by Mary. She hated flying the thing. However, when it came to Laurence Olivier, it was his favourite aircraft, and he wasn't a very good pilot. So it makes me wonder, yeah, I think you'll probably believe Mary that it wasn't great to fly, because the engine sort of above your head, didn't it? It was a very odd thing to look at. It was a seaplane. So that was the little link there, really, which I thought lovely. I threw into the book there, actually. But so I've looked at Laurence Olivier and all the propaganda films that he started to make, obviously, and get involved. And then that introduced me then to all the politics that was going on in Hollywood with regards to, you know, because America didn't join the war until after Pearl Harbor. But then you still got, you know, Winston Churchill recruiting actors to kind of spy for him, because obviously lots of German filmmakers out in Hollywood. So the whole thing was quite a mesh. And of course, when the war broke out, lots of British actors wanted to get back to Britain to join up. But Churchill told them to stay, because he said, if we're making propaganda films, we don't want, you know, we want British people to carry on playing the parts, etc. We're going to get the message over convincingly. But most of them just ignored this, and they did come back. I think it was just the older ones that stayed out there, who'd fought in the First World War. And Church said, we don't want you. So I've written about Olivier and the wonderful Sir Dirk Bogarde, who I just worship. I just love him, and I met him once. It was wonderful. And he was at RAF Medmenham, because he was in the photographic unit, which you probably know about. So there was Dirk and all the people he knew served, and of course he was one of the first soldiers who walked into Bergen-Belsen, and it changed his life forever. So that's why, you know, he became very distant towards the whole business of show business, and remained quite grounded and very sort of reserved, guarded person. And then of course, so that brought me into all of that area of the war, and the photographic work, Medmenham. And then last but not least, of course, I had to write about Audie Murphy, because what can I say, but, you know, sort of America's, you know, most amazing soldier, really, wasn't he? And his fact that he made the film To Hell and Back, which is the story of his life, and and of course, yes, I mean, he was very macho, wasn't he? He was the guy you want to spend, you know, share the trench with. But I had to get, you know, some American figures, and also Tony Curtis. So I haven't forgotten lovely America either. So I've tried to spread it, and of course there was Vivian Lee, who risked her health to entertain troops in the desert, and then I've introduced the, you know, some of the women who were serving as well, who then became well-known actresses as well. So it's yeah, so that one I was very lucky. I managed to finish that one during the lockdown time, because I don't know whether you know, but I helped run a bookshop. A Tudor bookshop in East Kent. One day you'll have to come and visit, and we've got beams and things, and King Henry VIII. apparently went into our bookshop. So it's part of Waterstones, which is now part of your Barnes and Noble. And I know the Spitfire Girls for sale in Barnes and Noble. Hurrah! So during the lockdown, obviously, I was unable to go anywhere. So in a way, it gave me a chance to finish Battlefield to big screen, which was a little beyond the deadline. So I'm hoping to hear from my publisher soon about a publication date, because I haven't had the proofs back yet to edit that. And sorting the photographs was a bit of a minefield because of all the copyright issues, etc. So that's been happening. And then I'm just towards the end of another book that sprung from that one. Have you heard of a series here called Dad's Army? You've probably heard of that, haven't you?
I have not. No,
about the British Home Guard, and it was made in the 1970s, and it's all terribly sort of, seat of the pants, old men coping with what to do if the Germans turned up. It's a comedy. So that sprung out of that one. And then there's one more I've signed up to do called Women at the Battle of Britain, where we'd be looking at the women who worked in the radar and Bentley Priory. If you get to come to England ever, Liz, you must go to Bentley Priory. It's the most amazing museum, where they commanded the Battle of Britain from. But there was a lot of women based there, obviously helping to plot where all the aircraft were going. So that's the plan so far. But yeah, I'm always looking out for another biography, really, because I think that's probably where my heart is. So,
well, this is all so fascinating, so wonderful. Thank you so much for the book. And for all of your other works. I can't wait to read those. And thank you for your time for this interview. And we'll just shift right into writing in just a minute. But I wanted to say thank you so much for this.
No, thank you for inviting me. I'm really touched that, your members wanted to, they the ones who read Mary's story. I just think it's really wonderful.